So let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Sonia Stringer. I am a very, very proud board member of the Canadian Psychedelic Association. Joining me here for this session is Cory Firth, the Executive Director of the CPA. Do you want to say a quick hello there, Cory?
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you.
And our special guest, Brom Rector, is joining us from Los Angeles. And I'm going to properly introduce you here, Brom, in just a moment, but please do say hello as well if you'd like.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for allowing me in, even though I'm not Canadian. I was telling Sonia, I feel like an honorary Canadian today, which is a big honor because you guys are our more enlightened brothers and sisters. And I'm excited to be here and talk about how to, ethically invest in the psychedelics industry.
Love it. And that is the title and theme of this webinar. I'm extremely pleased to have the opportunity to host this. And if you've been around the plant medicine psychedelic sector for more than a hot minute, and I'm sure all of you have, you've likely noticed that in the last 18 months, there has been a significant number of companies that have launched in the psychedelic industry or sector. And I know this brings up a lot of mixed feelings and opinions for people. Some people believe that businesses will be a very necessary component in making sure that these plant medicines get out to as many people as possible. Some people are really concerned, obviously, about the potential corporatization of psychedelics and plant medicine. Some people see this as an amazing opportunity to invest. And I would say, even if you're not interested in investing, as people who care about psychedelics and plant medicines, I really do feel it's our opportunity and maybe even our duty to learn about the businesses that are surfacing within this space so that we can be very informed citizens. And since this topic does focus on investing, I'm sure many of you here are curious about the potential of investing in psychedelic businesses. Some of you may have some concerns that this is perhaps just cannabis 2.0, that there's going to be a lot of hype, and it ultimately may not be the best place to be putting your money. What I want to know, and I know Brom is going to share a lot about this, is, of all the different companies that are surfacing, how do we determine which are really set up for success and which potentially may be bogus schemes to just kind of do pump and dump and, aren't really serious potentially about doing business in this sector? And how can we find opportunities that aren't just viable financially, but how can we find companies that we actually feel good supporting? Is there a way to potentially do some research or dig a bit deeper to uncover more information about the teams behind these businesses and their motives, and find people and businesses that are really aligned with our values, that are really here to not just make money, but potentially do really good work? These are all great questions. And in my opinion, there's no better person to answer those than Brom Rector. So thank you again, Brom, for joining us here for this session. And
Thanks, Sonia.
You and I got connected kind of by accident on YouTube. Please write this down. This is a resource you will all want to go check out. Brom is the host of both a YouTube channel and a podcast called The Integration Conversation. And if you do take time to go to YouTube, you will notice there are all kinds of videos from various people talking about investment opportunities in psychedelic businesses. And Brom, you really stood out for a variety of reasons. When I started watching your videos, I was quite aware just by listening to your analysis and your interviews that you actually knew what you were talking about. I don't know if you know this, but I actually used to do a lot of training for stockbrokers and financial institutions in Canada and the US. So just listening to your verbiage and your lingo and like the ways you were describing, the sort of approach that you took to analyzing these businesses, I recognized that you actually knew what you were talking about. And I wasn't surprised to learn that you have 7 years as a portfolio manager with various hedge funds. As I listened to those interviews, it was obvious to me too that you really had done a lot of research before you even brought a CEO in to be interviewed. You'd obviously spent a lot of time researching the company. And I loved the way you interviewed those people because it presented, I think, both sides of the potential of those businesses, both the strengths and the weaknesses. I thought you asked some very hard questions, and I wasn't surprised to learn that you're one of the people who's doing this work that does not take sponsorship money. I don't know if some of you are aware, but some of the people you may come across on YouTube or other places are actually paid by companies to present kind of the best possible side of the business opportunity. So it was really refreshing to find you, Brom, and it was perfect timing for me. Many of you may remember, gosh, it was May back March, I think it was, the CPA led a webinar on business ethics. And it was shortly after that time that we were actually approached by several different parties and some CEOs in this space and asked if we might be interested in helping to launch a trade association for the psychedelic companies. And the reason that we were asked is they really believed that we were coming from the right place, that we were very concerned about upholding the highest standards and business practices in this space, that we have obviously a great network in place and relationships and a real strong commitment to integrity. So even though we're not necessarily in the business of launching trade associations, Cory Firth, who's here, and Trevor Miller and myself worked really hard to launch the very first trade association in the space. It's called the Psychedelic Business Association. And it's a really interesting experiment because it brings together the CPA and a lot of nonprofit interests to work with many of these psychedelic companies who are obviously for-profit interests. And one of the things that we're really working towards right now is regulatory reform for psychedelics in Canada. And Cory, do you want to just mention briefly about the MORA? Because we do have some really exciting things happening, and I think it'd be worth just letting people know a little bit about the recent developments there.
Yeah, so we recently just launched after, we said 6 months, I think, when we first put it out, but I think it was actually more like 12 months to a year of working with various representatives in Parliament and at Health Canada, communicating with them around the initiative here in Canada, which is called the Medical Assistance in Dying Program. And we really saw after they announced that they were going to be revisiting the program and the elements of it, that psilocybin therapy could be a good adjunct there for assistance for anyone there at that end of life stage. And we had some really great conversations there, and then it opened up the door for some larger discussions where we've been able to submit a memorandum of regulatory approval to Health Canada. We did that 2 weeks ago. And the hope there is to instigate conversation with Health Canada, the rest of the representatives there on the MAID committee, and our united group that has come together across Canada to really put together a strong group of changes towards psilocybin therapy regulations here in Canada so that we can open the door for access for patients in need. So we just launched canadasupports.ca, which is our campaign page. And there you can find all kinds of details around our polling that we did that kind of instigated a lot of this, some of this, the stats and research behind why this is such an important time for this, and all the information that's there that's kind of pursuing this for us. And then you can sign up and you can join various little initiatives that we're launching over the next little while to help share stories and advocacy efforts across the board to help us get this done. So if you're interested in checking that out, I think Deanna or James will be adding that to the chat there. It's canadasupports.ca. And from there, you can sign up and get all the information on what's happening next.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And the reason that I wanted to mention the Psychedelic Business Association, Brom, is before we launched that, Trevor and myself spent, I'm sure, 50 to 60 hours talking directly to CEOs of various companies. And we really wanted to do our due diligence to make sure that, one, if we were to go to the effort of helping to launch this independent association, that it really would be the right fit, and that we would be inviting in people that we felt were not just poised for success in this industry, but also ideally doing this for the right reasons, and that they would be really good partners. So as I was doing my research, that's when I happened to find your YouTube channel. And I know I mentioned this before, but I want to thank you again publicly. You saved me hours of research. I listened to your interviews. I think I've listened to every interview you've done on the various companies. They were very, very informative. I've listened to some of them twice. I feel like I got not just a crash course in investing in psychedelic businesses, but truly in just analyzing any type of investment opportunity. So thank you again for putting that out there. I think it's an invaluable resource for anyone who's interested in plant medicine, psychedelics, and potentially what's going to happen here as more businesses enter into this space. And let me take a moment to just officially introduce you here, Brom. So he is the host of the Integration Conversation, a long-form video podcast about psychedelics from a business and investing perspective. Brom has personally benefited from the healing properties of psychedelics, and his life is 100% focused on finding, funding, and promoting companies that innovate on and increase access to psychedelics in an ethical manner. Prior to starting the Integration Conversation and Empath Ventures, Brom spent 7 years as a portfolio manager at 2 different hedge funds. You also have a CFA charter holder. You are also a CFA charter holder, rather, and you have a master's degree in computer science from Georgia Tech, and obviously have spent, at least 18 months or so analyzing businesses in this space. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Sonia.
Yeah, thanks, Brom.
My pleasure. Yeah, should I maybe give a little bit of background about how I sort of got to where I am, and then we can talk about, so
I would love to hear your psychedelic, a little bit about your journey with psychedelics specifically myself.
Yeah,
that could be a whole other interview, right?
No, I think it's important. I'll talk more about why that's an important question later on when we talk about analyzing the teams of companies. But so I think it's a totally fair question for me. I first became aware of psychedelics and really just the idea that you could take what many people would sort of consider, a party drug or something that's just like a drug and see it have mental health benefits over 10 years ago. One of my cousins unfortunately had a pretty traumatic childhood, and I remember her telling me a long time ago that she went to underground MDMA therapy. And at that time, I didn't even really know what MDMA was, but I just remember being like super curious, and my mind was kind of blown that this was even a thing that existed, that you could use, some drug that I was kind of raised in the all drugs are bad type environment. And so this was like a very strange thing for me to hear. But I read more about psychedelics in general. And, eventually I ended up trying LSD. That was the first thing that I ever took. And I did it alone after doing a ton of research. I think the thing that really pushed me over the edge was reading Sam Harris's essay called Drugs and the Meaning of Life. And as someone who considers himself sort of like a rational, like more atheist than spiritual, but still open to spiritual things, that sort of like rational approach to what psychedelics mean and how they could impact someone who's not some, crazy like woo-woo hippie really sort of made me feel like, all right, I'm going to do this. And ended up trying LSD, and my mind was like totally blown. And I really felt like it was a demarcation line in my life. Like there was like Brom prior to trying LSD and then Brom after trying LSD. From there, I sort of went on a journey of trying different substances, pretty much always with the intention of trying to, change my mind or have some sort of like introspection about my life and like what to do next, not really for like, a recreational purpose. My career, I worked at a hedge fund and did lots of different financial stuff. And as many people in the hedge fund world do, I eventually sort of got disillusioned and burnt out. Part of that was because of, my journey with psychedelics. It's hard to do, massive doses of mushrooms and still think that you're doing a good thing by trading stocks, those two things in my mind sort of really fight each other. And during the pandemic, I basically just had enough, and I finally, quit in 2020. And I feel very fortunate because my peak burnout and feeling of needing to leave the hedge fund world sort of coincided with psychedelics being a thing that you could actually talk about in a business or investing perspective. It's like these two things sort of coincided in a way that was like very good timing for me. But when I quit my hedge fund job, I didn't quit with the intention of starting a psychedelics fund or starting a psychedelics podcast. I actually quit with no intention other than I want to do something else with my life. And I sort of wrote down a list of all the different things I was interested in. One of them was psychedelics. And I had all this free time, and I just found myself, out of all the things on that list, spending so much time researching psychedelics. And of course, again, like I mentioned, there started to be these publicly traded companies like MindMed and Numinous and Compass around that same time. And I just found myself going deep into these companies. And one of the first things that I realized was that there were very few people on the internet that were talking about this psychedelic business that had any like real business background. There were a few people online, but most of them were like paid promoters, and they weren't really taking like a rational, level-headed approach. And so I just started literally recording like monologues on my iPhone of me talking about these companies. And I started getting good feedback. And eventually I got the idea to invite some of the CEOs on. And to my surprise, they responded to my emails and said, yes, I really didn't think they would. And not long after that, I started getting emails from people saying, hey, I have, I'm a doctor. I've got $100,000 I want to invest. You seem like you know what you're talking about. Where should I put my money? What do you think I should do? What do you think about this company? And I sort of realized that maybe I should start a fund, that focuses on psychedelics, because there were so many people asking me like how to invest in the psychedelic space. And so I did that. I figured out how to set up a fund. I set up my own venture capital fund, and it's still, in its infancy, but the fund does exist, and we've made 2 small investments into 2 startups that maybe I'll talk about later. And so now I'm basically just trying to keep up with this podcast while raising a venture fund that's focused on psychedelics.
It's a lot.
Yeah,
I can
a lot.
imagine.
Yeah, but it's good. It feels a lot more meaningful than what I was doing before. So.
That's awesome. Well, and could we maybe just quickly summarize what's happened in the investment space in the last 18 months? I know some of you may have been watching this very closely, perhaps others haven't, but it's staggering to see the rate of companies being launched and the amount of trading going on already. Could you speak to that? The number of companies that are currently being publicly traded?
So I think what really happened was, MAPS, we all know MAPS. MAPS has been doing research for a long time. That research finally got to a point where it was, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. And I think people saw that the FDA was willing to play ball with psychedelics. And that sort of caused many other companies to sort of form around other substances like psilocybin. And all of a sudden, we sort of saw this like Cambrian explosion of companies that were supposedly doing research or doing something else related to psychedelics. Last time I checked, there was something like 30 or 40 publicly traded psychedelics company, many of them based in Canada, because you guys have a, very
we're the
easy
best.
to deal
You
with.
can just
Yeah,
say
you
we're
guys
the
have
best.
you guys have a very liberal securities laws compared to the US, which is a bit more restrictive when it comes to things like this. And many of them based in Canada. And I believe the total market cap of all the psychedelics companies is something like $10 billion. So 18 months ago, the market cap of the psychedelics industry was 0. Now it's 10 billion. And the amount of private startups out there is countless. I mean, my inbox is flooded with pitch decks from different companies, some of them with good ideas, some of them with absolutely terrible ideas, trying to form companies in this space. And I don't see any signs of this explosion slowing down anytime soon.
Wow, that's incredible. So for those of you here wondering, should we invest in these kinds of companies? What would you say, Brom? Obviously there's some concern about risk. This is a brand new sector. These businesses haven't even been granted the legal right to sell these substances yet, or to potentially, bring those things to market. What about those that are concerned about the sort of corporatization of plant medicines and psychedelics? What would you say to people that are sitting there kind of wondering if this is the right thing?
So that's sort of 2 different questions. The first one is like, should you invest? Is it too risky? The answer is it's incredibly risky. This is super speculative. This is definitely like as alternative as an investment as you could possibly get. So even me, who is, my whole life at this point is dedicated to psychedelic investing, less than half of my net worth is invested in psychedelics. So I do not recommend that anyone put huge amounts of their own net worth in this. It should be a small percentage, just like I wouldn't advise someone to dump their entire net worth into Bitcoin. That said, oftentimes when you see these interesting opportunities like crypto, like psychedelics, like cannabis, it can be kind of silly to not get involved at least a little bit, right? These things do have the potential to have high returns. And I do think that we are going to see some pretty impressive returns from some of these psychedelics companies. So I think it's important, if you do care about diversification, if you do care about being exposed to this tide, you probably should invest a little bit, but you have to be smart about it. And we'll talk a lot more about how you can make intelligent decisions later on in the webinar. In terms of what if you're concerned about, the corporatization of psychedelics, I think that's a very, very fair concern. I am, concerned about this as well. But the fact is, capitalism is coming for psychedelics, whether you like it or not. And so the only question is like, are you going to get involved with it? Or are you not going to? It's you just choosing to sit on the sidelines isn't going to change anything in terms of like the big picture, right? So yeah, it's just kind of up to you if you want to be involved or not. And hopefully you can sort of vote with your dollar and try to pick companies that are operating in like an ethical and reasonable manner, as opposed to, in a scammy pump and dump sort of jumping on the hype train manner.
That's fantastic. So could you explain for the viewers the different kinds of companies? There's several different almost verticals servicing within
Yes.
one industry, right? And I'm not sure people really can appreciate like how diverse it's getting already.
Yeah, so there are lots of different types of companies out there. I think the first big category would be the companies that are doing drug research on the classic known psychedelic molecules. So these are the companies like Compass Pathways, like MAPS, even though they're a nonprofit, they're not inventing a new molecule, right? They're taking psilocybin and MDMA, and they're just trying to run a clinical trial to prove that psilocybin or MDMA might be useful at treating some sort of illness. In this case, usually a mental illness like PTSD or depression or something like that. This seems to be the most common type of company that exists. And while those companies are certainly very important because they sort of kicked this whole thing off, I think at this point, that space is a little bit crowded. And it's pretty difficult if someone comes to me today with an idea saying, we're going to start a company that's looking at psilocybin for some mental health thing, I would probably say you're about 2 years too late, buddy. Like, this has been done, and I'm not sure what your angle is going to be that's different than what's already out there. One of the challenges with companies that are pursuing these business models as well is that because they're using a known molecule that's existed forever, there's very little intellectual property protection around what they're doing, right? The FDA will grant you something called data exclusivity. So even if you use an existing molecule, you'll still get exclusive rights to the data that you generate from your study for, I think it's 7 years. But after that, anyone can use your data. And at the end of the day, people can get psilocybin and MDMA from many different sources. And so it's hard to imagine some of these companies like Compass Pathways and Mind Medicine, which is focused on just generic LSD, being able to sustain a profit in the long run. That said, what they're doing is like totally important to this industry, because without them, like this industry wouldn't really exist in a way. It's almost like they're the sacrificial lamb at the beginning. They had to come up and do this work. I don't know that they're necessarily going to get compensated for it in the long run. So those are the companies that are creating the generic, doing research on generic psychedelic molecules. Slightly more interesting are companies that are trying to create novel psychedelic molecules. You might ask, why would you even bother creating a novel psychedelic molecule? The ones that we have are quite powerful, and it doesn't seem like you would need to, make anything new. But there are some valid reasons. So for one, as safe as psilocybin and MDMA generally are, there are some people for whom they can be somewhat risky. Like the FDA currently won't allow people that have heart conditions to partake in any trials related to psilocybin, because psilocybin, in addition to agonizing the 5-HT2A serotonin subtype receptor, also agonizes the 5-HT2B receptor, of which there are many in your heart valves, and agonizing those receptors over and over again could potentially lead to some heart valve failure. So a question might be, can we create a psychedelic compound that has a similar effect to psilocybin, but doesn't hit that 5-HT2B receptor, which can potentially cause heart problems? More generally speaking, most drugs, even non-psychedelic ones, often give you, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, which is fine for most healthy people. But if you're someone who, has a heart condition, it can potentially be dangerous for you to undergo those circumstances. MDMA, on the other hand, there are some concerns about it being neurotoxic if you take it too much. So like another question might be, can we create an MDMA-like effect without the neurotoxicity risk? These are all types of questions that companies that are creating novel molecules are trying to answer. One of the big benefits of novel molecules from a business perspective is that when you're creating something new, then you actually have very strong intellectual property protection around it. You can patent that molecule, you can make money off of it for 20 years. On the downside, though, it is extremely difficult to get any sort of novel drug through the FDA. You have to start off not even testing it in humans. You have to start off putting it in rats to see if it's safe, right? Then you have to do safety trials. Then you have to do phase 2 trials. Then you have to do phase 3. We're talking, a 10-year-long drug development cycle that has a very high likelihood of failure. So big downside to the novel molecule business. And just for the sake of time, I will sort of put all the other categories into just a single bin that I'll sort of call the picks and shovels, and this sort of comes from the saying that many investors will use, which is like, the only people that made money in the gold rush are the people that sold the picks and the shovels. So this would be any business that is not creating the drugs themselves, but is creating some sort of accessory around the drug. Maybe some technology that helps you discover new drugs more effectively. Maybe it's something as simple as a clinic, right? The clinic doesn't necessarily sell the drug. They just create the space and have the personnel under which it is like safe and optimal to do the drug. This could also be something like a software system to train therapists. It could really be anything that goes into that third bucket. And one of the things that is kind of cool about those companies in the third bucket is that they have very little FDA risk, right? Like they don't have to go through clinical trials. They can potentially make money immediately. They can potentially be used by people doing underground therapy. And oftentimes their products can pivot to work with non-psychedelic therapy situations. So I'll sort of leave it at that.
Yeah.
I could kind of keep talking.
It's fascinating to see the amount of work being put into like digital therapeutics and potentially even software programs that would support the music experience that people might have if they're doing the therapy. There's training programs out there, there's clinics, there's all those sort of supportive businesses that are starting to put this around. The companies that are
the digital therapeutics, I didn't really mention that. That's a very, very fascinating rabbit hole for anyone to go down if they want to. Sort of the nutshell is, can we create psychedelic states without consuming psychedelic drugs? There's some evidence that certain types of like virtual reality and auditory experiences can induce psychedelic states, which would allow people that don't want to take psychedelic drugs for whatever reason to get the benefits of psychedelic therapy. So that's a whole entire other industry that's out there, which I have been calling psychedelics plus digital therapeutics and all this stuff under this big umbrella of experiential medicine. So medicine that actually makes you like feel something, and that that heals you during the experience rather than something that's like subperceptual. So
wow,
experiential medicine is the big meta trend here, I think.
Yeah, very interesting. So what's the process that you use? I know with your background in analyzing all kinds of companies and investment opportunities, as a portfolio manager for a hedge fund, you've got, I'm sure, a very particular way that you approach those investment opportunities. But what are some of the things that the people here listening could also adopt just to help them better ascertain which of these companies actually could be successful versus one that potentially?
So I mean, that is the big question, right? How do you analyze these companies? And by the way, guys, I'm super looking forward to answering questions at the end of this. So please think of your questions, even the hard ones, even if they don't directly relate to something that we talked about here. I want this to be as interactive as possible. So in terms of analyzing companies, it really depends. The process varies depending on the company, what they're doing. But I would say the big question that you have to ask, especially in psychedelics, is what is the problem that this company is actually trying to solve? This is always a useful question to ask, no matter what company you're looking at, even if it's not related to psychedelics. But in psychedelics, it's like extra important because there are so many people riding the hype train. There are people that are just trying to form a psychedelic company for the sake of forming a psychedelic company. And when you dig into what they're doing, it's like, wait, what are you actually doing? What benefit are you actually trying to give the end users? And oftentimes they can't answer that question. So the first question is, what problem are you trying to solve? And is it a real problem? Oftentimes people sort of make up problems that aren't really real and try to sell you on this idea that they're solving a problem. So one of the companies that I invested in recently is called Wave Paths. And Sonia mentioned just a minute ago that there are companies that are working on music for psychedelic therapy. So this company, Wave Paths, is solving the problem of suboptimal music for psychedelic therapy. What this guy that created Wave Paths discovered was that music will make or break a psychedelic experience. And he also discovered that many psychedelic therapists are terrible DJs, and they are not necessarily good at picking music. They're especially not good at being able to adjust music on the fly, depending on how the session is going. So if you can imagine, you've got a patient, they're having a bad experience. The therapist is over there trying to console them or calm them down, but then they're also over here trying to like adjust the Spotify playlist in real time. It's like a real problem. And so that is the problem that they're solving. And I think that's an example of like, is this a real problem? The answer is yes. So the second question that I think you should ask once you've determined that they're solving a real problem is, who is the team that is behind this company? And why is this team the right team to solve this problem? oftentimes we see people that have like no background in psychedelics or no background in, mental health trying to solve these problems. Going back to the example of WavePass, the music company that I was just describing, the guy that founded WavePass, his name is Dr. Mendel Kalin. You can look him up. He got a PhD from the Imperial College in London. And his PhD thesis, I'm trying to remember the exact title, but it was something like the impact of music on psychedelic therapy outcomes. So this guy not only has a PhD in like the effects of music on psychedelic therapy, I think he's like the only guy in the world that has a PhD on this specific subtopic. So if anyone in the world is going to create this company, it's going to be him, right? He's got the expertise, he's got the know-how. And it's like you almost want to find a company that is run by a team where it's like, it's hard to imagine any other team running this company, right? You want the team to be like such a good fit for the problem that they're trying to solve. If you can answer those two questions, like in a good way, then you're probably doing better than like 90% of investors out there. They seem like very simple things when I talk about them, but oftentimes when you just ask those two questions, the company's stories fall apart very quickly. And it's actually a pretty hard filter to pass. If you want to dig deeper, once you've answered those two questions and you've determined that the problem is real and that the team is the right team to solve it, I think you want to look for any sort of tangible momentum or evidence that they actually have figured out a solution that is working towards the problem. Again, in the case of WavePass, they're a software company, so it's a little bit easy. It's easier to do this than like a drug research company, for example, but they're not waiting around for psychedelics to become legal, right? They've already created this music platform. They've got a beta version that's being used by over 100 therapy clinics around the world. They're collecting revenues. They're, making tangible progress, and they're collecting real money already. So that's, something that you kind of want to look for. With drug research companies, it's a little bit more difficult because the drug development process is so long and complicated. It's hard to say like, oh, I want you to show me the progress you've made, because oftentimes you can't make any progress until you've raised money. But I think in that case, you really just want to look at, is the team actually qualified to do this? I can talk about some red flags that you oftentimes see with teams.
Please.
Yeah. So one of the this kind of gets into the impact and the ethical perspective. Okay. So one of the big concerns I know that people have is like, there are all these, capitalists and like money hungry people coming into the space. So if you're concerned about the ethical angle, what you want to do is you want to determine whether the people that are running this company are missionaries or mercenaries. These are like two separate archetypes that founders often have. And this applies, of course, outside of psychedelics as well. The missionary is the person who like genuinely believes in this thing that they're doing. They want to share it with the world, and they would probably do it even if they knew they were going to end up penniless at the end, right? The mercenary is someone who doesn't really give a crap about the underlying problem or the solution. They're just out for the quick buck. And in psychedelics is very interesting because there are lots of missionaries, people that have like benefited from psychedelics personally, and are trying to, start a company around it. But there are also a ton of mercenaries. So red flags for mercenaries. This is half a joke, but oftentimes I've actually found this to be useful. If their LinkedIn profile picture is them in a suit and tie, probably a mercenary. The psychedelic missionaries don't wear suits and ties. Another one, this one, sorry, I got to take a little dig at the Canadians here. If their prior role was an executive at a Canadian gold mining company, probably a mercenary. There are a lot of those. I've been seeing a lot of those.
Just in the chat, actually, someone just mentioned that. It's funny.
Oh, did they really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you were a Canadian mining executive that is now a psychedelic executive, probably a mercenary, might be best to avoid. Now, of course, these are not hard and fast rules, right? You have to sort of look at this in the context of whatever else is happening around the company. But these are just general signs to be aware of. Another thing that you can do if you're trying to figure out if someone is a missionary or mercenary is you can just ask them. I will legit on Zoom calls where people are pitching me, I'll ask people at the end, like, what has your experience with psychedelics been? When was the first time you did psychedelics? How have they impacted you? And generally people, if they're not, full of it, will answer these questions honestly. I had a very interesting phone call with someone not too long ago. It was with another venture capitalist who runs a venture fund that is just generic. They're not specific to any sub-industry, but they had found me on Twitter and they were curious about getting into the psychedelics industry and they wanted sort of my advice. So we're talking and I ask her and I'm like, so why are you so excited about potentially investing in psychedelics? And she says, well, it's this hot new industry and there's always opportunity in like hot new industries. And I was like, okay, what has your personal experience been with psychedelics? And she's like, oh, well, I've never done them. And I was like, well, are you going to? And she laughed and she was like, oh, of course not. She's like, I'm an investor. I have to be in control at all times. And I'm like, all right. Yeah, clearly just outed herself as a mercenary, right? And that's not a person that I would necessarily, want to co-invest with or something. And I think that, to be honest, a person like that is going to have a very hard time getting missionary founders who really believe in the companies that they're starting to, accept money from her, because generally founders that are missionaries want to, accept money from people that have their values aligned with their own. So, yeah, I think that's a pretty good rundown of how to evaluate the teams. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
Well, I'd love to interrupt you there and actually ask this from the viewers. I'd love to hear your opinions too. I think we all maybe have our own strong opinions about this, but how important is it for a CEO or perhaps members of a team to have actually personally experienced plant medicines or psychedelics? I personally believe if you're running a company like this or you're supporting this sector, that you really have no clue what you're doing. Yeah. Really what you're supporting unless you've had some personal experience. That's my own personal opinion.
That's why I wanted to know what Brom thought of his experience. And it's one of those things that goes back and forth. Like, do they have to have an experience? Is it part of the job role? It's one of those things.
I mean, it would be, I have not invested in any companies where the founder has not personally, benefited. I want to hear some sort of testimony from the founder. It's like, at least make up a story and tell it to me. You know what I mean? at the very least, like, give me that.
I'm pleased to see most people here agree. And I appreciate.
Just think for a second, like, try to apply this to any other industry. Let's say someone's raising money, someone's running like a Bitcoin startup, and you're like, so have you ever bought Bitcoin? And they say no. You're like, well, what are you doing then? Like, why are you doing this? And why would I trust you to run a Bitcoin startup if you think Bitcoin is, BS? It just doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't. I'm glad to see most people here agree with us. But
and also, I don't want to like gatekeep. I think we need people working in the industry, but also wary the people whose first psychedelic experience was last week, kind of want you kind of hope that the person that is doing this has been interested in the space for longer than a couple of days.
Yes,
that doesn't mean that they can't be successful. My big exception to that rule is when you're looking at drug researchers. So if you're talking about a drug development company, especially one that is creating novel psychedelic molecules, you really the most important thing is the person running this company someone with a background in drug discovery and drug development. They don't necessarily have to be a psychonaut. I think to that archetype of person, molecules are molecules, and there are very few people out there that are like experienced drug developers that are also like very into psychedelics, so you kind of have to take what you can get. And I would be much more concerned about experience in successfully developing new drugs than experience in like going to an ayahuasca ceremony.
Right.
That said, it would be ideal if you could get both.
Yes, excellent point. Well, and I appreciate in today's corporate climates, regulatory climates, political climates, legal climates, not everybody wants to be super forthcoming about that publicly, which I appreciate. However, I would encourage those of you listening and watching, if that is important to you, to do that homework, because if you really want to be putting your money behind organizations and companies you feel are as mission-led as possible, for me, that's a very important piece. I really feel unless you've had personal experience, you really don't know what you're supporting here.
And I think that the excuse of, oh well, they don't want to say it publicly because of legal ramifications. Personally, I think that's kind of nonsense. I mean, no one has ever gone to jail because they said in an interview that they did mushrooms a year ago, right? That's never happened once, right? And if you're running, your shareholders are not going to get mad at you if you're running a psychedelic company, right? It just there's no reason to not be forthcoming about this stuff at this point in time.
I agree. Could we circle back to intellectual property? I know that's a controversial topic when it comes to businesses. And if any of you have downloaded investor decks and looked through them, you may see companies make some pretty wild claims when it comes to intellectual property or medical claims related to their drugs or what they're potentially putting together. And how do we as consumers, unless we have a medical degree or we come from a science background, how can we effectively evaluate those kinds of claims? Brom, is there anything you do to fact check that, or what could we do to better understand if those are actual if there's some
Yeah.
validity there. Yeah.
So two things that let's start with intellectual property, because that to me is kind of separate from the medical claims thing. Intellectual property is a big concern. If it wasn't for Compass Pathways trying to patent things like, the color of the room, the soft music, and the therapist holding the patient's hand, I think there would be a lot less hate towards, companies getting involved in psychedelics. I really just wish I knew what those people were thinking when they did that, because first of all, every lawyer that I've ever talked to about this has said that those patents aren't going to hold up. And it just makes them and every other company in the psychedelic space look bad. So it's like there was no upside. There's no way they thought these things were going to hold up, and yet they did it anyway, knowing it was going to cause like a bunch of negative PR. So not a lot of love for Compass Pathways there. Although I think the CEO should still come on my podcast and talk to me. That's it. So there's sort of like the question around intellectual property is it good or bad? It's like, does it make sense? And are they actually patenting something that is, worth patenting? If someone is trying to patent a fundamental attribute of psychedelic therapy, like the things that Compass Pathways are patenting, that to me doesn't make sense. It's silly and it's like rent seeking. Companies should be patenting true innovations. If you invent a new psychedelic molecule that has some unique property that makes it really cool for a certain subgroup of people, please patent that. Please reap the rewards of all that work, right? But I don't want to see people trying to rent seek by trying to patent, psilocybin in any way, or just the basic processes of therapy.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you want to get the down low on intellectual property, you should check out the Calix Law Group and the founder, Graham. He's on Twitter. He goes to webinars all the time. He's like the number one psychedelic lawyer in the space. He's also my friend and a very cool dude. He's going to be on my podcast soon, hopefully. He tweets like anytime a company files any patent related to psychedelics, within like an hour, he'll tweet his opinion on it. So you should check him out. His name's Graham, and it's the Calix Law Group.
How would you spell that? Could you spell that? Calix?
Calyx, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone can maybe find it and put it in the group chat there.
Okay.
And if you find Graham on Twitter, you can find him. And he's also he's a very ethical dude. Like he's a patent lawyer that thinks most of the patents are BS, kind of, and so he'll give it to you straight. Definitely a guy that you want to follow on Twitter.
That's great.
In terms of evaluating the medical claims, this is a little bit more difficult. So companies that are making claims about the psychedelics benefits for mental health, I think that most of us in this webinar have probably experienced the antidepressive, anti-anxiety, therapeutic benefits of psychedelics, and it's almost like we don't need any research to validate that to ourselves. When it comes to the more esoteric claims for non-mental health disorders, this is where it can help to find someone who's an expert in whatever the claim is. So I've spoken to a couple of companies that are looking into psychedelics neuroprotective effects for stroke. So the idea is like if someone's having a stroke, there's maybe a specific psychedelic compound that you could give them that would basically allow them to have a much better outcome from that stroke than like someone that didn't have that drug. Now that is something that, I have personally never had a stroke while on psychedelics, so I can't personally speak to that effect, right? So in that case, I need to find someone who's an expert on strokes and get their take on it. It's pretty hard to do it without that.
Dr. Pamela Christo originally had planned to be with us today. Unfortunately, she got called away at the last minute, but she's got so much knowledge, not just as a medical doctor, but as a researcher. And it would be great to have another interview sometime soon, Brom, where we could potentially bring people like her in to comment on those types of things. Because I think if you're fairly experienced, you can recognize very quickly if some of those medical claims are actually legit or not. And, for a lot of the average people out there like myself, you see a lot of fancy words and you may grant it credibility, but it may not really represent anything unique or special, right?
Absolutely. And one of the challenges, especially when you're talking about these like novel molecules or these companies that are doing really kind of weirder research in psychedelics, is that generally drug research, the FDA requires you to start with animals. And if you're researching like an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication, it's hard to know if like a rat is depressed or not. We have all these different models, these like different ways that we test and try to estimate if the rats are like happy or sad. And the crossover between rat brains and like human brains, it's certainly not a one-to-one comparison. And even when you get to like the higher level animals like primates or pigs, the models for mental health disorders are very, very crude models. And so it's one of those things that until you're running studies on humans, you can't really make any definitive claims.
Great point. Well, I'd like to open it up for questions in just a moment, but before we do, is there anything else you could share that would help those of us who do want to invest in this space, but we want to be smart, obviously, where we put our money, and we really do want to support those missionary-led companies that ideally are here not just to make money, but to do really great work and help just create greater access for these important medicines worldwide. What have you done? Because I know with your hedge fund, you really seek out those companies. How do you determine, if someone's really behind this for the right reasons, and how do you figure out kind of where their ethical barometer might lay or their compass?
Yeah, so it's kind of tough, if you're talking about investing in these publicly traded companies, the best you can do is, try to find interviews with the founders and just watch as many of them as you can and see if they pass the sniff test. I think there are some companies out there that are publicly traded that are, doing kind of the right thing and have the right ideas. If you want to look at a company that is working on novel molecules that I think has a great team that has smart people behind it, even though their CEO was a Canadian mining exec, so this is an example where that rule doesn't necessarily apply. Bright Minds Biosciences, very cool company. I also think that Cybin is a great company. This is another publicly traded one that has a pretty wide pipeline. Their CEO is like a super experienced pharma exec that has done lots of different drug development projects. If you want to look at a company that is probably led by one of the most head-on straight dudes in the psychedelic industry, Field Trip Health, Ronan Levy is the chairman. He's like a super nice dude, super ethical dude. He was the first guy I interviewed on my podcast. And in terms of investing in clinics, they're probably the go-to stock. I should probably say they're probably the go-to team. Who knows what the stock is going to do, but I think the teams behind those stocks are certainly trying to do the right things in an ethical manner. When it comes to investing in private companies, this is where my advice may not necessarily apply to you because I don't know how many people are actually investing in private companies, but I luckily am able to, get on Zoom calls with these people and talk to them. And then I can ask them the hard questions myself and see what their responses are. One thing I will say that's kind of interesting about the psychedelic space is that because it's such a new space and a lot of these publicly traded companies have like really small market caps, is that the CEOs will often actually respond to your emails or Twitter messages. So you'd be surprised. I think if you find a company that's publicly traded that you are, curious about and you want to get the CEO to answer a question, more often than you might think, they will actually respond to you if you hit them up via email or just on Twitter. So I would encourage people to actually reach out to these people and hit them with the questions. Even if they don't respond, it'll at least make them think in their head, maybe I should, think about this and maybe mention it in my next interview. These people are much more accessible than, the CEO of Apple or some other large company might be.
Yeah, the smart ones for sure, right?
Yeah, for sure. I know Ronan Levy from Field Trip, their market cap's like 250 million, which is certainly not small. That dude will respond to anyone on Twitter. He came on my YouTube channel when I had no subscribers. So yeah, a lot of these people are very, very accessible, and I would encourage people to try to reach out to them and ask them questions if they have them.
Super, thank you. All right, well, speaking of questions, those of you here, we'd love to hear your questions. Please do put them in the chat. And while
I've got a few here.
Okay,
yeah, and by the way, if you one other thing you can do if you want to invest ethically is, and you don't have a lot of time, is you can find someone to invest on your behalf, like me. So hit me up at Empath Ventures.
I was going to say what
if you want exposure to some private psychedelics companies through a venture capital vehicle. Yeah, that's going to be the end of my plug for myself. I'm not here to just promote the fund.
Well played, sir. Yeah. Actually, and before we get into questions, let me just quickly mention Brom recently became a paid member of the Canadian Psychedelic Association membership site. So for those of you that are members, just go look at Brom in the membership if you have additional questions. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer.
That is true. I will probably respond faster on Twitter, but I will also make sure to keep checking the inbox for on my Canadian Psychedelics Association profile.
And not to add too many plugs, but if you go to join cpa.ca, you can sign up for membership if you're not a current member as well. There's a lot of cool folks involved in the back end there.
Yeah, and this is just a sample of the types of webinars and things we present on a regular basis. So there's all of our plugs done. Let's turn it over for questions.
All right.
Yeah, I had a
Cory, did you have
question to
something?
kick things off from my end. So the CPA, it's our mission to educate about and advocate for psychedelic access as a basic human right. And the discussion around decriminalization is ramping up here in Canada. I know it is as well in California, specifically around the opioid crisis and everything that's gone on with COVID. I'm just curious your opinion around the decriminalization pathway and how that affects the business pathway, the capitalism pathway, I guess.
Absolutely. So, decriminalization is generally the first step towards like legalization. Very few things I think stop at decriminalization. One of the things that is like the most distasteful to me out of all the things that I've seen in this industry are some of these CEOs that are anti-decriminalization. It's like one of the word like that to me is just disgusting. And like, I just hate it. So of course the big question here, in case it isn't obvious, is like, if these things are decriminalized, then these companies won't be able to make any money, right? That's kind of like the underlying point here. First of all, I don't know that that's necessarily true. Decriminalization doesn't mean that I can open a store selling mushrooms on the corner, right? If under decriminalization, you still have to go to a drug dealer, right? You still have to only pay cash, not use credit card. You probably can't order online. People that have been doing psychedelics for a long time probably have no problem, going to their hookup to get their mushrooms or growing them for themselves. But for the average person, for my mom, who I think is watching this, I don't know that she necessarily is going to go to like the random dude that's like selling mushrooms, right? My mom isn't going to do this until she can just walk into a store and pick them up or get them under prescription from my doctor. So I think, first of all, even under decriminalization, I think that there will be plenty of people that will go the like legal pharmaceutical route just because they're not comfortable with that sort of like gray market semi underworld thing. And then second of all, another thing that you can do if you are concerned that decriminalization will destroy profits of these capitalist companies is you can invest in companies that will make money whether or not decriminalization happens. So I was talking about the company WavePass, which is doing the music, right? That company is going to make money. That company will make more money if mushrooms are decriminalized, right? Because there'll be more people doing mushrooms and that means more people need trip music. So there are companies out there that have business models that are such that like they will actually benefit from decriminalization. There are also certainly some companies out there that will probably get hurt from decriminalization. Compass Pathways, I know I've been ragging on them a lot on this this webinar, but like if they really do end up getting synthetic psilocybin approved by the FDA, but it costs 10 grand. I think even my mom might go to the drug dealer instead of going to the doctor, right? And paying 10 grand. So, Compass Pathways will certainly probably be hurt by decriminalization unless they seriously like lower their prices. So yeah, you just have to think about it. It's not as simple as like decriminalization is bad for companies.
Yeah, I typically agree with you. I've had a couple of conversations recently with some of the CEOs, some of the companies that you're mentioning, and it's the same idea. Like what we're doing, I think if we accomplish what we're doing at the CPA, everybody wins. And at the end of the day, they're all kind of putting themselves out of business with this healing anyway, don't you think? Maybe that's a little bit too wishful thinking, but sorry, Sonia, did you have another one before I jump into the question?
On that point though, Brom, wouldn't you agree that even if decriminalization happens or even legalization, right? Legalization and medicalization are very different things, and that there'll always be, in my opinion, a portion of the culture that will want to go work with a licensed therapist or a doctor. They wouldn't necessarily want to do this on their own or with someone who isn't properly trained.
Yeah, and in fact, that's a good point, Sonia. I forgot to mention this. One of the things that people often say when they're considering investing in psychedelics is they're like, oh, this is just like cannabis. No one really made any money in cannabis. I don't think this is like cannabis. And one of the big reasons why is because with cannabis, if you want the medical benefits of cannabis, all you have to do is just smoke the weed, right? Like if you want the pain relief from cannabis, you smoke the weed on your couch and the pain relief comes. Much of the data around psychedelics for mental health shows that if you actually want real change from psychedelics, it's not enough to do them just by yourself. You actually do need to have someone guide you through the experience. You do need the integration. That's like a critical component of it. And there's been some studies that have shown that without that integration and without that like guide component, you can sometimes end up worse off than you were before if you just do psychedelics on their own. So the need for all of those touch points with your healthcare providers creates like a lot more business opportunities around psychedelics than there are with cannabis.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
For sure.
Excuse me. Just a reminder, if you have a question, if you look down below, just in case you're not familiar with Zoom, there's a little box there that says chat. If you click on that,
Yeah.
actually, it
Yeah,
might
I've
be
got
over
a
to the
few
right.
here.
Sorry. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
a few.
I see.
I
Yeah,
can
go
read
ahead.
them off here if you'd like.
Yes, please.
So Rebecca asked, what do you think about psychedelic ETFs? Can you recommend any good ones?
I personally don't own any of the ETFs. For those who don't know, ETF means exchange traded fund. Generally, these ETFs just hold a basket of the top psychedelic companies. So if you don't want to spend the time doing the research yourself, you just buy the ETF and that'll guarantee you exposure to the psychedelic sector. If you're pressed for time and you don't really want to, go through the work of like learning what companies are out there, then yeah, the ETFs are fine. Keep in mind that the ETFs do charge fees. So you will get lower returns than if you just held those stocks individually. There's certainly nothing wrong with buying an ETF. But if you're like really interested in the psychedelic space, you're probably doing yourself a disservice by like outsourcing all of your research to an ETF provider. It's also pretty easy to just go and find the top companies and just invest in them on your own. So yeah, ETFs are kind of like a lukewarm thing in my opinion.
Interesting.
Neil has
this next one. Yeah, I've got a bunch here, and
yeah.
Where did you see? You saw another one in the chat. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I see
yeah.
Neil Reeves Newson
Yeah.
said
Right.
thoughts around real-time biofeedback devices and trips, auto-adjusting music
Sure,
based on
let's
heart
take
rate
that
activity. So the company WavePass that I've been talking about, that is actually like on their roadmap. So it makes a lot of sense, right? It's like if you can actually figure that people are kind of freaking out, then you can maybe calm them down with music based on biofeedback. I think it's interesting. I think it has, it's interesting to an extent. I think it'll probably work. In general, I think that like the neurofeedback and the neuroimaging stuff, it's like intellectually interesting. How much is it really going to like impact therapeutic outcomes? Like I have a lot of people pitching me these ideas of like recording brainwaves during psychedelic trips or recording brainwaves during the integration session afterwards. And I guess the idea is that you can build up a model of, people's brainwave patterns, and you can use that to determine whether they're depressed or not. And my question is always like, well, what if the brain reader says that the person's not depressed, but they still tell you that they are? Like, what then? Are you going to tell them that they're not because the imaging says that they're not? Ultimately, it comes down to the person's subjective experience and how they're feeling. It doesn't really matter. This is the challenge with mental health. It's like, it ultimately comes down to what the person's feeling. It doesn't matter what the biomarkers say.
Awesome.
But in terms of adjusting music based on heart rate, love that idea. I think it's very cool.
Yeah, I use myself. I use one of those Muse headsets when I do my trips, and then I glucose monitor and everything. I just kind of track all that, just like for my own use. But
yeah,
I see that being something powerful, like over time, especially with smaller doses, or like I think specifically MDMA over time with PTSD can be very helpful. But yeah, it's all kind of hearsay for me anyway. But I just want to give a plug to Sonia's hair. Douglas is giving a big shout out to Sonia's Zoom hair. And there's questions kind of happening all over the place. So I'll try to drop into what's I think are the most in order here. So there are several current stakeholders who are currently holding stocks. This is a long one. Hopefully you can catch all of this. Holding stocks of many of these companies, which have been in a multi-month downward trend since February 2021 highs, with further downside, especially given recent broader market fears. Is it fair to say that by late fall or Q4 of this year, that something is as significant as the result of Compass Pathways Phase 2B results will provide a catalyst to the sector?
Yeah. So so the question is basically the psychedelic industry, at least the publicly traded companies. There's been this downturn. What's next? I think people oftentimes get a little bit too caught up in the short-term price movements. At the end of the day, this is drug development. Drug development takes years. And drug development is also driven by these catalysts, like the results of clinical trials. A lot of these psychedelic companies are correlated to each other because they're all in the same industry. So yes, if Compass Pathways or Mind Medicine releases like positive phase 2 data, I would imagine that you'll get some sort of bump, in the overall like index. That said, a lot of the companies that I think exist now that are publicly traded will probably fail, and new companies will emerge to take their place. But yes, I do think that, the next thing that's going to move this up is going to be, some kind of positive clinical trial results for sure.
Awesome. This next question here, is it only the founder that is important, missionary versus mercenary? I'm thinking of companies that may have founders with financial background. However, the team of physicians or researchers are mercenaries with long histories in the field.
I think they may have meant missionaries there. So
Yeah.
balance.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, no one is a pure missionary and a pure mercenary. It's a spectrum. And yeah, it's, you're never going to get, someone who's like totally pure, passing any sort of purity test. So I think the point is just collectively, does it seem like the team is doing this for the right reasons? I mentioned the company Bright Minds Biosciences, their founder, like I said, he's, he's one of these gold or like mining execs, I think. I hope I'm saying that right. I could be wrong, but that would be funny. But the scientists that he's sort of surrounded himself with are, they're like people that have a long history of researching psychedelic specific drugs and also just brain drugs, neuroscience drugs, and people that are clearly passionate about the space. So yeah, I think as long as, the company is, I think it's just a thing that you sort of have to feel out.
David has a good comment here. It could be the Kinsey scale of mercenary versus
yes,
missionary.
exactly.
Some kind of spectrum. Awesome.
I think we've got a couple more here. Some maybe when Pam gets on here, I'm seeing a few more medical science ones. Let's see. There is a company that is aspiring to find a modification of ibogaine. Given the safety issues with ibogaine and the overwhelming need for treatment of opioid addiction, does that have a greater potential for success compared to classic psychedelics, in your opinion?
Yeah. So you're right that ibogaine does have safety issues. A lot of people have died from ibogaine. I'm not sure which company this person is referring to. I know Mind Medicine is working with 18MC, which is a derivative of ibogaine. Unfortunately, I think the patent on 18MC potentially already expired. I also don't know how good 18MC is at delivering ibogaine-like effects while being safe. So yeah, I think that in general, though, if hypothetically, if you created a safe version of ibogaine that was just as effective at getting people off of opioids, that would be like a huge commercial success, most likely.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's one of the few medicines too that has a very limited history of clinical trials compared to the others. So I assume the length of time it will take for that to be approved will be longer, even though the potential
part of the reason that it has a limited history of clinical trials is that there's documented cases of people dying from taking it. So the FDA doesn't like to green light trials that might kill people.
Yeah.
bad for business, So
it's
yeah,
bad
that's
on your scorecard.
definitely not good.
A quick thought came in as a secondary to that. Any thoughts on Amanita muscaria? Do you have any opinion on?
I've actually thought about this. I don't think I've seen any companies that are doing research on those mushrooms. I was actually just wondering about that because they are legal, right? They're not scheduled, at least in the United States. And so hypothetically, someone could start like selling them now.
Right.
But yeah, I actually don't know too much about those mushrooms, but I think you actually can kill yourself if you eat too many of them, right? They are like legit poisonous. It's my understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll see someone try to turn those into a product at some point.
And yeah, just to go back to ibogaine, William, thank you for your comments. We certainly don't mean to be knocking it. It's been very successful at helping several people, overcome opioid addiction, other things. So if any of you have not,
shout out to Trevor Miller.
I was going to say,
Dose.
Yeah. If you haven't seen the movie Dose, that's very educational in terms of.
He's down in Mexico doing great work with ibogaine right now and DMT, I believe. Let's see here. Rohan's asked about writing a couple of times here. So Matthew Ball has done a great job demystifying the streaming industry. What kind of essays can this industry benefit from? What is not being written about?
So I think what is being written about too much are the benefits of psychedelics for mental health. What's not being written about enough is all the benefits of psychedelics outside mental health. So yeah, I think I actually said in one of my podcasts a while ago, it was called like 10 startup ideas for psychedelic companies. And it was basically like 10 things that you could do with psychedelics that are not mental health. Go check out that podcast. I also have a text version of it on my website. I think that people have just really bought into the psychedelics for mental health thing, which is good. I mean, they're great for mental health, but there's a lot of other potential out there as well.
What can you give me rattle a couple off there
Yeah,
while we have
sure.
you?
So, I mean, one of the ones that always gets the juices flowing is psychedelics for sexual enhancement or treating sexual dysfunction. That one's always fun to talk about. I actually just yesterday, I'm drawing a blank on the company, just announced a trial for MDMA to treat female arousal disorder. I'm trying to remember the exact name, but yeah, basically MDMA for sexual dysfunction in women. But I think that that's just the beginning of like the intersection of like psychedelics and sexuality. Psychedelics also have been shown to have very powerful anti-inflammatory effects. Inflammation is linked to aging, so there's potential crossovers between psychedelics and longevity research, which is another one of my big interests. Another interesting thing about psychedelics is that most of them function by agonizing the serotonin receptors in your body. 90% of our serotonin is made in the gut, which makes me think that psychedelics might be useful to treat things like irritable bowel syndrome. I am also very interested in the psychedelic molecules that don't actually function through the serotonin system. So if you've ever heard of like salvia, most people would consider a psychedelic, but it doesn't use serotonin at all. It uses the kappa opioid receptors. And that's like a whole different category of drugs out there that are psychedelic, at least culturally, but not like chemically the way that we think of them. And I think there's like a bias against those drugs. Noetic, which is one of the biggest psychedelic venture capital funds out there, like refuses to invest in any companies that are looking at any of those non-serotonin based psychedelics, just because they don't feel like they have enough knowledge to, evaluate the claims, which to me makes me think that that's like an area to focus on because it's like being overlooked by others, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. Even if you look at like how MDMA really came up, it was all about couples and relationships. And
yeah,
I know anecdotally for myself, I've had a lot of power with my partner on MDMA. It's an incredible connector.
Absolutely. Yes, Mind Cure is the name of the company. Thank you, Deanna. I have all these companies use mind in the name, and eventually they all sound the same kind of. By the way, I think that's potentially another way to evaluate these companies. At this point, if any company has the word mind in the name, they're not creative thinkers, because like millions of other companies have started with mind in the name. So any new company that has mind in the name, sell it instantly. It's a joke. I'm
just trying to make sure I'm catching everything here. There's the chat and then the Q&A. So it looks like, how does the average person get into the private companies you mentioned, if at all possible?
So if you're first of all, you generally have to be an accredited investor. What that means is going to be different depending on if you're in US or Canada. So you can invest in a venture capital fund like the one that I'm running. If you don't want to do that, you can try to get involved in a syndicate. Basically what syndicates do is they raise money from like private individuals, and then that syndicate collectively invests in a specific company. If you go on websites like AngelList, there are a number of different psychedelic syndicates that you can join. Of course, you have to be, accredited, or you can just invest in my fund.
That was the last question. Can we invest with Empath Venture without being an accredited investor?
Unfortunately, no. And that's not my decision. That's the government's decision, sadly.
Mm-hmm.
I would assume running a fund brings with it many regulatory strings and rules and regulations you have to follow, Brom. So
yes, lots of the government definitely has their opinion on who should and should not invest, unfortunately.
I'm sorry if I missed anyone's question. I was trying to keep track of everything here. I don't know if there's anything else, Sonia.
I did see one more, and I don't know if any of us knows how to answer this, but I think it's a great question. Douglas, he's saying, I'm wondering if there are companies that are leaning into the indigenous model of relational versus transactional.
Yes. By relational, what exactly, Douglas? Can you expand on that a little bit? Like, what is the indigenous model of relational versus transactional? That said, I mean, I think the answer is no. I don't think that there are any companies that are doing that. But this does bring up something that people, he just said SP, let's see what Douglas has to say here. While he's typing, I was going to say that here we go, like a mode where you're building through investment in the relationships. Yeah. So I don't, the question is like, are there any companies doing this? The answer is no. I mean, I don't think that this kind of thing really like fits well in with the company model. I think this would be more, nonprofit based or something. One of people oftentimes, especially when they see like the patent claims that Compass Pathways is making, they get this idea that, the psychedelic companies want to push out people that have been doing psychedelics for a long time. This could be indigenous groups. This could also just be like hippie people that like to grow mushrooms in their basements. My hope for the psychedelic industry is that those people, the indigenous groups, or the people that, want to grow their own mushrooms and do them on their own, I hope that we get, decriminalization and laws that allow those people to keep doing what they're doing. I don't want to see companies like come in on those people's territory. Like there's room for everyone here is kind of like what I think.
Absolutely. We all need healing. So
yeah,
the market's
absolutely.
endless, it feels like.
Yeah.
Well, that is a point that's come up a lot. The current population, 7+ billion, there's enough opportunity for everybody. And I think more and more, it's certainly what inspired Trevor and I and Cory and others involved at the CPA to even launch this business association was this, intention of collaboration versus competition. And not to say that business won't be competitive. That's kind of the nature of the beast. But that ideally, if psychedelics give us anything, it's potentially this way to work together in a more collaborative way than we have in the past. And, perhaps even birth a new model of collaboration in business that hasn't been done before. Who knows?
Yeah. And I do think we will see companies that are operating clinics. They may have, tiered pricing. They may have, for lack of a better word, like scholarship programs. Like if you can demonstrate that you don't actually have any income, that you might be able to trade something or get something cheaper. A new question. Could you speak to investor interest in psychedelics in other continents other than North America? It's hard for me to speak with authority on this just because I'm based in the US. And so everything I see is through the filter of being in the US. That said, the largest publicly traded company that's doing research in psychedelics, Atai Life Sciences, is based in Germany. So obviously there's some appetite for psychedelics over there. Europe is kind of interesting. On the one hand, they do seem to have like pretty liberal drug laws. Switzerland literally gives opioid addicts like pharmaceutical grade heroin so they don't overdose, and Portugal has decriminalized all drugs. But at the same time, if you talk to like European investors, many of them are very old school and like won't necessarily consider investing in this type of thing. But ultimately, it sort of just comes down to the person. I don't know that you can really make like broad claims. The Conscious Fund, which was one of the earlier venture funds in psychedelics, is based out of the UK. So yeah, I don't really know. I think it's hard to really make a judgment there.
And who knows how things will change in the next 3 to 5 years, right?
Yeah.
Things are moving at the speed of light. And I think if there's one thing we can count on, it's probably going to be a lot of unexpected change, expected and unexpected change in the years coming.
Douglas has another point. Are there companies that are working in cooperation with traditional ritual and knowledge, very clear on having an intent? Yeah, this is actually an interesting question. So if you've ever like been in an ayahuasca ceremony, you pretty quickly realize that there's a lot more to psychedelics than just the drug, and that the rituals around it can have a huge impact on what the experience is. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is when you see these pictures of like what MAPS is doing and what Field Trip Health is doing, oftentimes it's like the person is lying down on their back with an eye mask on and they have headphones on, and that's kind of the extent of the ritual, right? Can you incorporate some of these like other elements that people have figured out? I hope so. And I wish I had a list of companies that was working on doing this. I think part of the problem with at least the drug development pathway is that the FDA wants things to be as consistent and controlled as possible. You know, when you're doing science, you try to manipulate one variable at a time and hold everything else constant. And when if you're trying to evaluate something as complicated as like a ritual with like groups of people and like some shaman, you know, blowing tobacco smoke in your face, that's like so many more data points that you then have to account for. And I think because of that, that has made a lot of these companies try to simplify what's happening besides the drug as much as possible. I hope that over the long run, we will see some of these more complicated rituals, whether they're like indigenous based or not, because I think that those types of rituals can really, really make the experience like more powerful to the individual.
Yeah, and I think if you go into the companies and you look, like you were saying before, dig into the team, right? You look at someone
Yeah.
like Numinous, who has an advisor like Gabor Mate, who's on board with them, and his work with traditional tribes and all those rituals that he brings to his work and his
Yeah.
advisory commitments. I see him with integrity there, and
Mhm.
and then it brings up a whole nother topic here, just around psychedelic tourism. And I don't know how
Mm,
much you talk about that, but that's a big. I don't know if you
yeah.
have anything to say about that. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's a big thing that's been around for a long time, right? Because it's
Yeah.
something that's sort of in the legal gray area in many countries, and appropriate. And what a lot of North Americans have done is traveled abroad to do these things. So, do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on any of that space?
Let's see. I guess there are a couple things I could say there. So my personal take on like the psychedelic tourism thing is that I know that you could argue that maybe there's like some negative effects of that, and I'm sure there are, but overall, I think like without that psychedelic tourism, we probably wouldn't be where we are today, because I think a lot of people's minds were opened by either doing that themselves or hearing stories from their friends that have done that. Um, Another part of this is like, we're talking about ibogaine, right? You can't run an ibogaine clinic like in the US, but you can run one in Mexico. You can't run a DMT clinic in the US, but you can run one in Mexico and Costa Rica. And I've actually been approached by a lot of different startups that are like, they're based in the US, they're run by Americans, but their business plan is we're going to like open up a clinic in Jamaica and Costa Rica and Mexico. I am still trying to decide how I feel about these businesses. On the one hand, it's like, this is the best way to start treating patients now. On the other hand, when you look at the types of corporate structures that have to be set up in order to do this, there are a million ways for cash to just disappear, you know, and never
Mhm.
make it back to the holding company in the US, which is very bad if you're an investor, right? Um, it's it just opens up the door to lots of like shady activity, and the corporate governance is like a very complicated question that needs to be answered. Um, yeah, I don't know really what else to say about psychedelic tourism.
It's interesting. And just to go back to your point there, Douglas, I know that's a concern for the board members of the CPA. We've done a fair amount, but can do so much more to make sure that the public is educated about the history of Indigenous practices, and do everything we can to make sure that people really appreciate that when these medicines do become generally available to the public, that they don't think that it's only through this company that this was recently birthed, right? Obviously,
Oh,
there have been Indigenous peoples that have been practicing this work for centuries, and that deserves so much homage and credit. And we're also very, very passionate about making sure that the people that have been doing this work in the underground are recognized.
yeah.
And there is room for everybody, and things are evolving. But I personally, and I know Cory feels this way, all the board members, we want to do everything we can to make sure that people really appreciate the history and the lineage behind this. And we certainly encourage all of you that have that knowledge to keep talking about it and educating people about it, because it's really important to understand the history behind this.
I saw Kaylee here. How is the psychedelic community ensuring ongoing financial compensation to Indigenous knowledge holders and ensuring priority access to members of those communities? So there are some companies that are trying to give back. There are some venture funds that are trying to give back. One of the venture funds that was formed last year, it's called Vine Ventures. It's run by Ryan Zur, and I believe they have like a what is it, like a pledge where they're going to donate half the profits that the fund makes to various Indigenous groups. I also know that there are some people that have tried to create sort of like ethics pledges. I think there's one called the North Star Pledge, and they've gotten a couple of companies to sort of sign on. I'm a little bit fuzzy on what the specifics of those things are. One thing I will say, and I mean this like, I don't mean to be controversial or anything, but I think that sometimes, like, while it is important to like respect the, you know, the indigenous groups that have like done a lot of this work, and while it is important to respect, you know, the people that are not indigenous that have been doing this stuff underground, it's like, if you go too far down this road of like trying to find the original indigenous source of knowledge, you end up like in a loop, and it turns out that there is like no original source. I've heard countless stories of people that have like worked with, you know, shamans from the Amazon or whatever, and then they find out later that that guy who they thought came from like a long lineage of shamans, that one technique that they really loved, well, he just like made it up. So it's not like some ancient thing, right? um and I think oftentimes it can be like seductive to think that you're finding some true, pure, unadulterated source of like enlightenment or knowledge, and it turns out that, you know, you're not. This happens in yoga all the time, by the way. Like, people will like go, you know, the yoga that people seek, like the original form of yoga, turns out there is no original form of yoga. And you can just sort of like, if you're trying to find the person to compensate that has like invented this thing, you will never actually find them, because they oftentimes don't exist, right? That's not to say that we shouldn't, you know, financially like give benefit to those tribes. A lot of them have been put in this like really crazy situation where this ritual that they've been practicing has been made illegal, and now all of a sudden there's like a bunch of white people profiting off of it, and I'm sure that would piss anyone off, right? And so it's like, you want to compensate the people that have probably been unfairly harmed by regulation, and, you know, criminalization of these substances. But I think it's also just important to like, I don't know, fairly value or like take a sober look at like what is the actual knowledge that you're picking up from those things, because it's very hard to track like the lineage of these rituals.
Well, Brom, wouldn't you agree
Yeah.
too, though, businesses, savvy businesses, and this is perhaps where, you know, having access to those CEOs, especially at this stage, is
Yeah.
important for people that are watching, who feel that it's important for companies to be considerate about the indigenous practices, and
Yes.
potentially make sure that, you know, the work they're doing is available to those communities. I would encourage everybody, you know, send a message,
Right.
contact the CEO. The more they hear that, the more they'll, you know, be aware that
Yeah.
that's an important consideration for the marketplace, and
Yeah.
may potentially make that a big part of their entire mandate, right?
Yeah, and I would
Indeed.
argue too that like part of the what's lost in translation is due to some of that colonization, and that
Mhm.
almost like how you investigate a CEO or a business, you have to investigate the lineage or the rituals that a retreat center or a shaman
Yeah.
says that he or she is bringing to the table too. Because I think that there is a lot that was lost, but I don't necessarily think that's all due to, you know, business or capitalism. I think it's just the nature of colonization that has happened, which is an unfortunate piece that we have to get back.
Mhm.
Yeah. So in terms of, trying to think of I feel like there was like a lot said there. I'm trying to sort of like
Yeah,
respond to it
I may
bit
have
by
jumped in
bit.
on
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
Sonia said. I was just trying
No,
to get on a
sorry. I'm
soapbox to
trying
make a point. I
Yeah.
apologize.
So in terms of, you know, businesses, so yeah, it totally depends on like the, I think it depends on the substance. I think it depends on like the type of treatment that you're doing. Like, if you're talking about something like ayahuasca, right? It's like, there's like an obvious like indigenous history there. Of course, there are questions about like which specific tribe was it? Like, is it from this? You know, even within the, if you actually try to book a trip to South America to do ayahuasca, you'll quickly discover that there are like multiple different traditions, and you know, it's like, which one do I do? Which one am I appropriating here? It's like hard to find that exact answer. On the other hand, if you're looking at like a ketamine therapy, well, ketamine didn't exist until the 1950s, right? And so like, is there any indigenous like ritual that you're you know, taking advantage of by like administering ketamine to someone? I don't know. Maybe there is. I'm sure someone has like taken indigenous ritual practices and used them during a ketamine ceremony, right? Which is like, then you're using like a synthetic Western drug with an indigenous practice. And you know, I don't know that we necessarily need to compensate the creators of ketamine. I'm sure they're doing just fine, right? So the question is like, how much is the drug playing a role? How much is the ritual playing a role? I don't know. My hope is that, you know, like I said, the people that have been doing these rituals for, you know, however long, will be able to continue doing these rituals. And if they want to, you know, allow outsiders to participate in them and charge money for that, or allow barter or whatever, that they will be allowed to do that. that the people that are, doing things that are sort of like separate from those rituals will be able to do that as well. And hopefully we won't see too many like white people in headdresses conducting rituals. Like certainly don't want to see that, right?
Exactly. Well, and I really appreciate the intelligence behind these questions. These are complex issues, right? Obviously, none of us have, definitive answers on any of it, but I really do appreciate that as conscious consumers, we can educate ourselves, we can educate others, we can do our due diligence if we are going to invest in this space and really support the companies we feel are doing the best work possible, to making this accessible and fair. And trying to address some of those more complex issues for sure. Well, and I realize we're probably a little over time. Brom, thank you. My goodness, I'm sure we could stand here for hours and never run out of things to talk about when it comes to this topic.
We need to do a part 2 for sure.
We do, for sure. So thank you everyone for being here. If you enjoyed this, would you please let us know in the comments. If you are current members of the Canadian Psychedelic Association, you're in our website. Go look up Brom. He's in there. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer any other questions you might have. If any of you know of companies that you feel need to be highlighted, you may want to reach out to Brom and let him know that. I know you've interviewed a lot of CEOs of some of the main companies, but I know you're really looking to highlight more of the women in this space and perhaps talk about some companies that are doing really interesting work that, most of us don't know about yet. And would you mind sharing too, it's the Integration Conversation, which you can find on YouTube. Would you mind sharing your Twitter handle, social handle, whatever information?
Yeah, so I did post my my Twitter in the chat. First of all, thank you, Sonia and Cory, for having me here. Really appreciate it. Honored to be here. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to us, kind of ramble on. I know everyone's time is valuable. If you want to find me online, my Twitter handle is The Real Brom. Brom is spelled BROM. My venture fund website is empath.vc. If you just type empath.vc, you'll find it. The podcast is the Integration Conversation. Type it into Spotify or YouTube and it'll come up. And like Sonia said, if you want to continue this conversation with me, feel free to message me on Twitter or on the Psychedelic Association website. I do try my best to respond to messages that I get. And more than happy to keep this conversation going.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brom. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate your time and attention. All right.
Thanks, Brom. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.